If you're a Westerner, do you want to know what the secret to happiness is, at least in this life? Several hundred years ago, Thomas Hobbes famously remarked that human existence was nasty, brutish, and short. And that was a truism not just in his day. Famine, extreme poverty, disease, war, oppression, these things have been the norm, not the exception throughout human existence. That was until now. If you presently live in the Western world, then you are extremely, extremely lucky. We enjoy unparalleled health, wealth, and freedom. If there ever was a time, if there ever was a place to be born, it's right here and right now. That realization is the secret to happiness. Yet not according to our kids' generation. They're being taught to believe that they live in the worst of times. In fact, the world supposedly is even going to end in 12 years. You see, even if our kids go to a Christian school or are even homeschooled, many are believing a great lie. The great lie that the Western world is fundamentally evil, that it's racist, it's sexist, it's xenophobic, it's exploitive and repressive. It's certainly not a culture that is worth celebrating. How and why is this happening to the most privileged generation to have ever walked the face of this earth? Well, that's what we're going to be talking about in this Thursday morning Bible chat. Hi everyone, I'm Mark Leeming from the 1 Minute Preacher, and welcome to this Thursday morning Bible chat. If you're new here, please do watch this video all the way to the end, and if you decide to subscribe, don't forget to hit that notification bell. Now, perhaps we could say that the origins of this great lie first began with a man by the name of Karl Marx, who lived during the 1800s and became the dominant figurehead of communism in the 20th century. Now, Marx angrily looked at the world through a lens of economic exploitation. Since the rich, according to Marx, owned all the factories and all the means of production, they could exploit the workers at will. Long story short, Marx predicted with absolute certainty that the workers would become so exploited that they would rise up in revolution. They would rise up against their oppressors, seize control of the factories and all means of production, and everyone would live happily ever after. The only problem was none of that proved to be true. In fact, the workers in Western democratic countries, they didn't rise up because things were going quite well for them under capitalism. And so by the 1950s, it became impossible for all but the most fanatical believers to take any of his economic theories seriously. So did that mean then that these revolutionary types gave up the fight and simply went home? No, they continued to still look at the world through a lens of oppressor versus oppress and merely applied it to other things in our culture, such as race, gender, sexual identity. And after brewing for many years in our universities, it's now spilled out into broader culture. And here's the thing that you need to understand if you're a parent. Because of its prevalence in our culture today, our own kids now see the world through this prism, through this lens of oppressor versus oppressed. And it's something that they may not necessarily be overtly taught even. It's just something that they naturally pick up from Twitter or Instagram. And guess what? Because of its stance on so many of today's moral hot button issues, through this prism, through this lens of oppressor versus oppress, Christianity is now viewed as the oppressor. It is certainly not seen as a defender of the oppressed, the exploited, and the underdog. Our kids may not be able to articulate it in quite that fashion, but they are under enormous pressure to either compromise their faith or reject it altogether. So as Christian parents, here are two things that we can do. The first is theological. Suppose, for example, your child comes home from school and is complaining about some important historical figure, that he was a racist, and therefore he deserves to be erased from the history books. Point out to your child that, well, yes, racism is wrong, but unfortunately, throughout most of human history, it was accepted as normal. And ask your child that if he or she had lived back then and had come to a realization that racism was wrong, would they have had the moral courage to act differently? Ask how Jesus' teaching on he who has never sinned casts the first stone, or take the plank out of your own eye before you judge others, might be applied to them. Ask them how they think Jesus would have responded. And the second thing that we can do as parents is help our children zoom outside of the Western world and compare us with, say, Saudi Arabia, Iran, China, North Korea. Don't be afraid to admit that, well, yes, we're not perfect, but is there really any other place? Is there really any other time that your child would prefer to live in?